Hi, you're watching Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and on this episode I'm going to be speaking to UK author Marc Sidwell. Marc is a graduate of the universities of Oxford and Warwick, and he's the author of the brand new book, The Long March. He's also co-authored another book with Professor Anthony O'Hare called The School of Freedom. He's currently the deputy editor of the Smith magazine, which plans to launch later this year. He's also worked as head of personal finance for The Telegraph, as well as spending 5 years as a senior editor at City AM. Marc has also worked as a publisher to several major UK magazines, including The New Statesman. Without any further ado, let's have this important conversation with Marc about the current state of play when it comes to cultural Marxism and its toxic effects upon Western society, and more importantly, what we can do to respond to that in a meaningful way. Marc, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show this evening and talk about these profoundly important issues that you touch on in your new book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, by the way. But why did you write a book? What was it that motivated you to actually write this book?
Thanks very much for having me on, Brendan. It's great to have a chance to talk about it. Well, I come from a sort of policy background. I work quite a bit in the think tanks in Westminster, generally from a sort of free market economic point of view. You know, that sort of Thatcherite tradition, had a lot of sympathy for that. And then I worked in business journalism over the last sort of decade or so. And so I'm interested in putting those sort of writing skills to work. But I've also always had an interest in the cultural side of the debate. And it's something I think that, you know, people who think a lot about economics sometimes miss out on. So really this book was an opportunity for me to think through some of these issues, which I thought were always important, and now even more so than ever. And I think we've seen that particularly in recent months, where cultural issues suddenly come to the fore, and people who just thought about the economic side of things suddenly find themselves a bit shocked and wondering how the ground has shifted under them so much. People
have probably heard of Marx. They might have even heard of Herbert Marcuse, who you talk about in your book. But Antonio Gramsci, who is he? Why is he so important to the current cultural context?
Antonio Gramsci is an Italian communist in the interwar period. And he was locked up by Mussolini. He was considered very dangerous. And he was very interested in the question of, you know, why Marx wasn't getting the traction he should have got in the mind of the communists in Western Europe, in these big industrialized nations where they felt, well, you know, there's this massive underclass, this working class who should be revolting against this terrible system. Why aren't they doing it? And what he became interested in was the sort of the cultural frame, the idea that there was what he called a hegemony around, where because all the institutions were sort of lined up around the capitalist system, it couldn't be undermined. So he was very interested in the idea that you would use a sort of cultural approach. You would change the culture, and that would allow you to change the economic background. Now, he wrote about this while he was in prison, but he was obviously writing in Italian, and because he was also imprisoned for many years, these works were kind of hidden away. And it wasn't really until the late 50s, the sort of 60s period, really, where they started to come to light again. And then they really fed into a sort of new left movement that was developing in the West, and really influenced people to think about this idea of cultural institutional change.
One thing we're starting to hear about more and more is people talking about the Frankfurt School. But what exactly is the Frankfurt School, and how did it come to have such an impact on the modern West?
So the Frankfurt School sprang up in Frankfurt in Germany, and again it was people who were interested in the idea of, you know, bringing about socialist or communist change. Really, not just people who had a sort of, you know, an interest in improving slightly society, but really wanted to remake it from the ground up along new lines, to build a new world. And they had a great deal of money put into this institution by a grain merchant and his son. And they brought together people who were interested in these kind of sort of culturally Marxist, if you like, ideas. It was kind of Western Marxism, a sort of adaptation of the original Marxist idea, which was much more economically focused. And what happened importantly is that because of the Second World War and because they were Jewish and they were communist often, so they were really expelled from Germany, or they fled for their own safety and were taken in by the United States. To its great credit, it was always very good to refugees in this period where it could be, and it was a natural haven. But unfortunately, when they got to the United States, they continued to believe that fascism was around every corner in that society, which had in fact saved them. And so they looked at the New World and its capitalist system, even though it was fighting the Nazis and over time the communists as well in the Cold War, and saw an enemy, saw something that was on the brink of becoming Nazis. They said, things like the bourgeois is almost a Nazi already. They were terrified of this mass communication society, its mass entertainment. And so the Frankfurt School really brought this idea to the United States, and it became very, very popular in academic circles. And so that was a sort of route into the intellectual heart of Western society, all these big influential American universities, and reaching out from there through the generations of teachers and students. And in particular, an idea of critical theory, which really changes academia in a very profound way, because it talks about academics not so much as people seeking the truth, but again seeking to remake society, acting more as activists, as people who have a vision, want to impose it, want to help change the system for the better.
Tell me, do you think that the Frankfurt School could have been resisted? And if so, why wasn't it? Was there something in the academic world that was perhaps lacking philosophically? Or were people post-World War II just too comfortable or too tired after the intense struggle against Nazism? What was it, do you think, that allowed it to embed itself so effectively?
I think there's perhaps a kind of intellectual exhaustion by the time you're in the sort of middle of the 20th century. It's been a terrible experience, two dreadful wars, the most civilized countries in the world, like Germany, going insane and tearing themselves apart. And there was a kind of seduction to these new ideas, and perhaps it's always a danger for academics. I think, common sense and people who weren't in academic circles would look at their country fighting these terrible evils and making everyone very rich and prosperous and building a sort of a capitalist society that seemed to work on many levels, and would feel good about that. But people in academic circles were reading these very obscure writers whose writing was extremely difficult to understand, because their ideas really were very odd, I think, if you examine them. And they were written in German, in Italian, and there was a pride in that. Sort of, it's coming from Europe. We are the only people who understand this. And gave them something to set themselves up against the mass society, the mass entertainment that they saw everyone enjoying around them.
It seems to me that perhaps one of the missing components here today is what I would call perhaps an authentic understanding of history. You talk to your average person, you say, do you understand, for example, who Edmund Burke was, and perhaps the great debate he had with Thomas Paine? Do you understand perhaps Wilberforce and his role in England and even in America? And a lot of people just look at you blankly on these profoundly important questions of history. I read an article just the other day on the BBC about a woman talking about her Nigerian great-grandfather who had a very prosperous life running a slave industry, and he's a Nigerian, and there's a sort of perhaps a jaundiced view of history where it's not just people have received perhaps a bad formation, but they've got a lacking formation and understanding. Do you think that's the case? If so, what can we actually do to perhaps reignite that fire to bring back some more of that authentic history, which helps to shape our understanding of these complex issues?
Well, I think that's very true, and part of the problem that's happened, I think, is that again you've got people who at the top, or who see themselves as a kind of intellectual elite and are very, very clever, who set themselves against that kind of history. There's sort of this critical theory idea, this idea that you look at that and you say, well, we need to debunk that, we need to explain what's wrong with that, we need to problematize that, and those are the people who end up not only influencing university students, but also, particularly in the UK, and I imagine in New Zealand and other places too, they start controlling the curriculums and the teacher training as well. And what happens as a result of that, of course, is that you have control over the kind of history that's taught. And yes, there are lots of problems in our history and lots of bad things that have been done, and it's always important to talk about those. But if you don't see the broader context and see, Britain's role, the empire's role in ending the slave trade, if you don't understand that people who did some bad things can also be remarkable people that need to be remembered, if you don't include that in your history, then you're blind to what's going on, and you end up in this sort of terrifying situation now where people seem to want to create a year zero and wipe out all the past entirely and create a sort of even deeper forgetting.
Page 30 of your book, you say the following: we suffer, we are told now, as then, not from acute problems that can be tackled one by one, but from a chronic and incurable sickness that has infected every aspect of the way we live. Now, it seems to me that this idea of whether it's patriarchy, whether it's heteronormativity, whether it's masculinity, white supremacy, it's almost a bastardization of the Judeo-Christian idea of original sin, except when you look at something like original sin, that doctrine, there is a baptismal grace or regeneration you can get to be cleansed of that. But this one, it seems there's none of that. And it strikes me as it's more perhaps like, this is something Rod Dreher wrote an article about actually in the last couple of weeks, about almost like the pseudoscience of eugenics, where people were born with a deficiency that couldn't be cured. So the best thing was to breed them out. And it seems I'm hearing that sort of language. Is that your take on it? And are you concerned by where this could lead?
I think that's very true. I mean, it's kind of like original sin, but it's definitely a world with no forgiveness of sins within it. And it's a world where the future that they have in mind really doesn't have a lot of us in it. It only has sort of favored people in it. And in that sense, I mean, this seems extreme, but people have been writing recently. John Gray wrote recently in the UK about how much this looks like the Cultural Revolution in communist China, where huge numbers of people were being wiped out. If you think about in Stalin's Russia, where the kulaks were wiped out, classes of people, sort of bourgeois people, middle class people who are running businesses and running their lives for themselves, don't belong in this new future unless they're going to be re-educated, and that's chilling. And I don't think people understand where possibly that could lead, at least in a sort of soft sense. It's not so much that we're quite at re-education camps yet, but certainly re-education training in sort of HR departments. And there's a silence that is developing. It may not be that everyone is going to agree, but people learn very quickly that they'll lose their job, or they'll lose their friends, or they'll lose their social standing if they don't nod along or keep silent, and that creates all the more room for bad ideas to take root.
One of the things you talk about in the book is you make that correlation between, or that connection between, Marxism and sexual revolution. There's a couple of times you quote the criminally underrated Mary Eberstadt, and who I think, just as a side note, is one of the most underrated of the greatest female minds of the last 100 years or so, along with probably Elizabeth Anscombe, but that's another point. The question I have for you is this connection between sexual revolution and the Marxist revolution. Why do you think this happens? Is this simply perhaps personal pathology? So the founders of these movements and the activists who are drawn to them have got their own personal issues within family life, so they're drawn to that as a form of rebellion? Is it people who perhaps see themselves as trying to outwork Rousseau's idea of the original man, strip away all the rules and he finds his freedom? Or is this that you've got Marxism recognises that perhaps the family is the strongest defence against collectivism, so you want to tear that to bits so that individuals are left more recruitable for the collective? What's going on there, do you think?
I think that's definitely right about the family being seen as the enemy. And, I mean, it's one of the things that doesn't tend to come up on the BBC News these days is that, you don't have to look very deeply into the Black Lives Matters, the actual movement, the sort of organized force behind Black Lives Matters, to see that one of their goals is destroying the family. which in the context of what's happened to the family in Black America is a particularly tragic and desperately foolish idea. But also, what happened was the popularity of Freud to the Frankfurt School was very strong. It was a kind of Freudo-Marxism that they developed, where they were very interested in these sexual questions. And they had this model of repression, that all these things were being bound back, and that if they could be released, that would go towards the sort of energy of the new age they were trying to create. And that, it sort of flowers in the 60s, as you say, Herbert Marcuse in the US, and he writes books about this that get him, huge mass appeal. And of course, sex sells, and telling a new generation of kids that it's great, you can go out and have lots of sex and that'll put it to the man was a winning formula, really. So in a way, it's not surprising that worked and continues to have traction. And of course, there were some benefits to that. There were some restrictions in the rules, and people weren't necessarily giving people always the freedom they wanted. But what happened, and people like Charles Murray have looked at this now, is that you get you've now got a sort of social sorting where people in the upper classes, upper middle classes, are actually behaving in a more traditional manner, family formation, marriage, looking after their own kids, while below them in sort of the lower classes of society, poorer classes, like in Black America, there's much less family formation. There's not necessarily looking after their own kids, and all of the attendant problems that come with that.
And it seems to be true that leaves them a lot more vulnerable to the various winds and tides that come against us all, really, whether it's socially or individually. You're a lot more vulnerable without that strength of family and virtue present.
Yeah, I think that's true. You want your big brother to take care of you, and also, whatever movements come through, you cling to. And Mary Eberstadt's very, very interesting on lots of things, and the book that I talk about in mine is she has a hypothesis, which I think it needs some testing, but it's an interesting idea that the generation that now is very woke and is clinging to that with a sort of, sometimes it seems almost a sort of hysterical passion, is a generation that on a very large scale has not been raised in families in that traditional manner, and that they've lost a sort of rooting there that we don't recognize until it's gone. And then we look around and we're surprised by these emotional displays and these desperate clinging to new sort of political religions. But without the family background, it's possible that plays into it.
One of the grand promises, really, of Marxism is that the sort of the utopianism, the grand utopianism. It promises you heaven on earth, effectively. And I think you can see why perhaps the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, the state of life for most people is starting to improve. Wars are settling down. Technology is taking on leaps and bounds. But then all of a sudden, World War I, World War II, the awful horrors of communism, and all of a sudden, I think it's a very shattered dream, utopianism. But it's still promised today through Marxism in its various forms. Are we now, though, at a point where there's just so much nihilism around, though, that sooner or later they run into that cynicism and that critical mass of cynics? Even if they manage to recruit a group of young people at university, they get a bit older and they get a bit more cynical and they get disinterested in the project? Or does it not matter at that stage? Are they so embedded in culture that won't be an issue for them?
Well, I mean, the cynicism is a problem. I mean, the real danger is, of course, is with revolutionaries is that you can tear things down quite quickly. So if you build up a critical mass and you suddenly launch yourself around and tear down all the statues and make it so that no one can speak about things, you can change the culture in a way that might be irreversible. And of course, that's always the goal of the revolutionaries. The idea of a sort of long march through the culture, the sort of Gramscian idea, was that you would build this up over time, but then when the moment comes, you strike hard and you make the difference, and you enter a new situation. So there's a real danger that can happen, even if they might not be able to sustain it past a certain point. But I think the real danger is, I talk about it in my book, a sort of institutional incompetence. When everyone becomes obsessed with other issues than just sort of getting on and doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing, when everything becomes political, and everything needs to be judged on those terms of, are you living up to the particular new rules that we've set in place? Are you the right kind of person? Are you woke enough or whatever? then they lose the ability to do the jobs they can do, and that's very corrupting. And I think, in this current crisis with COVID-19, you've seen that certainly in the UK, the US, lots of other places. Maybe New Zealand, I don't know. I say you guys have done quite well on that, but from a certain perspective. But
yes, well, generally, and certainly the way some people are talking, you would think that we have a divine saint ruling our country. So.
There's that problem too. There you go. Yeah. I mean, the Church of England, I think, is coming through very, very badly this crisis. They've done things which have really shocked me. Again, I talk a bit in my book about some of their focuses of things like, well, we've got to make sure that we hit our climate change targets, and we've got to, I don't know, be diverse enough and apologize enough for how deeply racist we are. But the actual, saving souls, preaching to the population, that kind of thing, not so much on that. And they were very happy to close down all the churches in the UK and go even beyond government advice on that, and still very, very difficult to hold services. And so I think people are losing touch with the jobs they're supposed to be doing, and that's a real danger.
In the book, chapter 8, you talk about Václav Havel, the Czechoslovakian statesman. You quote his famous little anecdote about the greengrocer and the sign that he puts up in the shop. You also talk about in that section Timur Kuran, who's the guy who promotes the dual preference model, the idea of keeping one public preference and one private preference. It seems to me if that's true, then ultimately Marxism is it's a lie, really, in a sense, because it talks about the collective and the community and the commune, but really all you've got is individuals who are trapped in individual little silos who are not relating to each other. They're keeping the most intimate parts of themselves away from everyone else out of fear. And obviously that speaks to the sort of fatal flaw, if you like, in what communism is supposed to be and what it's supposed to deliver. But later in the book, you quote, let me see, is it historian Robert Service, who says, communism in Western Europe held next to no appeal to the imagination of the individual working class in whose name it had been invented. So the thing that I wonder about, though, is even if communism is this great lie, and even if you have this sort of separation of preferences, is it possible, though, that we are not in the West one big enough disaster, like an economic collapse of the right size, away from people out of desperation embracing that lie still, because they blame everything on the former way of life and have no vision for anything other than the false dichotomy?
Yeah, well, so just on the sort of people hiding their faces and so on, I think it was probably Václav Havel, or certainly one of the dissidents in sort of Eastern Europe communism, who said that they didn't just have two faces, they actually had 5 faces under communism, because there were things they could say just to their wife. And then there was things they were slightly more careful in front of their kids, because their kids might say something stupid to someone else and get them all killed or locked up. And then, there was your neighbors, and it would move out and out until you were in public, at which point you were just completely lying and not saying anything at all. And distressingly, as I say, I think we recognize, at least in a small way, that today people are becoming very, very careful. And when that starts to descend on a country, on a culture where people can't speak in public, democratic politics becomes impossible. People start losing any touch with what each other say, but also with how to improve things through discussion and persuasion, and that's a real problem. On the idea about the working class not being interested in revolution, that's very true, and I think it's very consistent historically that the most dangerous people in revolutionary terms are the highly educated. It's not, as it turns out, the people from below who are going to lead the revolution. And that's sort of the problem I talk about in my book. Is the very clever, very highly educated people who get mad theories that they want to try out on the rest of us. And if they get the chance, then yes, they can put them in place, even though they're not the mass of people. The mass of people tend to go with the elite, and that can go the other way too. I mean, Davison Hunter, who I talk about in my book, is very interesting on the history of Christianity and how it takes over, Roman thought and the empire through people like Origen and so on, who were working at a very high intellectual level and really persuaded the elites of the empire that this was an idea that was credible. It wasn't just about mass conversions. And so, as you say, then because you can have this elite takeover without ordinary people agreeing with it, one bad event, and things can go very badly wrong very, very fast. In the UK, we had Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. He lost the election and he's no longer Labour leader, but and he was very hard left. He wasn't the sort of normal, certainly not Tony Blair sort of soft left that we're used to, sort of market liberal. I mean, he was very hardcore, and one bad election, and he would have been in power, and you would have seen the UK changed, I think, in ways that would have been extraordinary.
I think this is too with your Orwellian aspect of a false history starts to come into it as well, and the disinformation, because if you believe strongly enough all of the wrong things, you are likely to believe, like if you believe that your very existence is under some sort of white supremacist system, then you're probably going to justify in your mind revolution, and very violent revolution too, as the means to overthrow that, right? It sort of all starts to cascade into each other in that regard.
I think so. I mean, like you said, there's an important difference between people who think, oh, well, we should be trying to improve things. Of course. There's always room to improve society and to try and do things, and charity and works and all the rest of that. But what we're talking about are people who think the entire system is so rotten that it needs to be replaced. And when people use terms like white supremacy, patriarchy, now that's basically what they mean. They're saying that it's not, racism is no longer about individuals who are racist and can stop doing that or be taken down from doing that. They're talking about the system as racist, in which therefore everyone who is part of that system is racist. Herbert Marcuse, who's often seen as a much more moderate kind of revolutionary. He certainly wasn't in favor of violent revolution, and was the darling of the 60s counterculture. But there's something I quote in my book where he complains about the terrorists in Germany, the Red Army, who are killing people to bring about the revolution. But he still says, well, look, every ordinary person in the capitalist society is not just as bad as a Gardner concentration camp, is literally as bad as Hitler and Himmler in the Nazi regime. But don't kill them. But he still saw all of us that way, and still wanted the whole thing torn down because it was that disgusting to him.
You talk about the concept of the blob, which is a fascinating, highly technical term, I'm sure, and I'm sure lots of academics are going to be talking about it if they read this book. What is the blob, and why is it so pernicious? Why is it such a problem?
The blob is an idea that came out of people in the US and in the UK who were working on educational reform, and they found it incredibly difficult. And they found it so difficult because there's a whole sort of loosely allied group of people who think the same way and control so many of the institutional levers around education. And this would be, the teachers, the unions, the people who are setting the curriculum, people who are on school boards, whatever. There's a whole sort of, loosely allied group of these people. And if you're trying to reform something, there are just too many of them, and they sort of defend the system as it is in such a way that there's nothing you can aim at. It's a kind of faceless problem, and you go after one thing and you charge at the fog and it disperses, and you turn around and it's all around you again, and you can't solve anything. An interesting example more widely of this, and my point is I take it from education and say you can see this around. It's a bit like in the UK after the Brexit vote, the battle of those people who wanted Brexit to happen, if only on democratic grounds at least, found themselves facing all the sort of army of the establishment. It wasn't about elected power, but it was about judges and newspapers and people in courts and people who had powers, positions of influence, and MPs, whatever, and they were all coming together and doing their best to stop it. But a very recent example in the US, which I think shows this quite well, is the 1619 project. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a project out of the New York Times. It's a very radical project. Basically, they want to change the history of America, reframe it so that America is seen as fundamentally as a slave state, as entirely illegitimate, and get away from the 1776 founding to 1619. Now, that project goes from a newspaper, which has a high degree of respectability still in the US, but then it's taken up by schools who put it on their curriculum. It wins the Pulitzer Prize, so that gives it, again, tremendous credibility. And indeed it plays a very strong role in the recent riots that have spread across America with Black Lives Matters. And the person who is sort of the figurehead of the project for the New York Times has sort of proudly said, I'd be very proud if people called these the 1619 riots. I really think that would be a great thing. So there's lots of different parts of the same thing, but they help to spread an idea, they help to legitimate it. And if you try and charge after it, it's everywhere around you, the blob. There's all these people who are working together, and that's very, very difficult to fight.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because these ideas are often quite insidious. You think about even little things like how many people believe the urban legend that Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," and that's just one small idea, and it's still with us. And in this case, you've got these ideas that you try and tackle, these false representations of history or whatever it might be. Not only is the thing constantly shifting, but you're often accused in a very passive-aggressive way of being the problem for even daring to disagree.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, it comes back to this idea of not wanting to discuss things. It's immediately going to that tone of anger, and this idea that sometimes it's said recently that silence is violence. So you have to speak up and say what they want you to say. You can't even be silent. But certainly that speech of the wrong kind is a kind of violence, and that seems like a very small idea, but I think it sells. It sells everything really. Once you've done that, you're in huge amounts of trouble, because suddenly you can't have peaceful discussion leading to persuasion, leading to people changing their minds. There's only force and violence and intimidation that's left to you. And good luck with a free society when you can't talk and discuss, in the way that we're doing now.
Let me quote page 65 of the book. You're actually quoting another journalist here. You say that who says the real divide in British public life is no longer between the main political parties, but between the political class and the rest. Here's the question: if we're attempting to win back politics, if you like, for goodness, truth, and those important things, and we're trying to do that in a way that we believe is virtuous, how do we avoid falling prey to that same trap, where we start thinking of ourselves as perhaps being a more enlightened class, some sort of, I don't know, political Gnosticism, if you like, where we've got the knowledge that they don't have, because it seems that's the current trend. How do we avoid that?
No, I mean, I think you really get to the heart of it there, Brendan. It's enormously important, and one of the dangers with fighting, culture war is that if you're not careful, you can lose simply by playing. That the left has set up this system where everything becomes political and everything needs to be about the fact that they're going to control the institutions. But if you fight back by saying, well, okay, that's fine, we'll just do the opposite of that, and we'll take everything over and indoctrinate people into what we want. You've lost simply by playing. I mean, and the institutions again lose out because they're not interested in doing what they should be doing. They're acting as agents of indoctrination for a particular point of view. And I think there's something about conservatism and not being a revolutionary, which is about saying lots of life isn't about politics. Lots of life is sitting back and having a drink, or having a chat with people without worrying about what they think about, I don't know, gender roles. And so you have to aim for a world where there is space for all of that, and that requires a certain humility and a willingness not to get into a state of permanent revolution. But it is a great temptation, and it's one of the dangers in approaching the sort of fighting back.
One of the things you talk about in the book is how politics now is often it's been captured by people often who have it as a career path. They've done their political science degree, or they've worked for someone in politics, and that's about it. And now they're in politics themselves. I see one of the dangers here possibly is the corporatisation of politics, as opposed to the concept of public service. And there's been a dumbing down, if you like, a lack of wisdom. Do you think there are not enough of perhaps the more worldly wise, the business savvy, the people who have lived life outside of politics actually in politics at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. It's possible that may change in the UK as Brexit goes through and we start to settle into that. I mean, one thing that happened in the UK was that a lot of power flowed out away from Parliament. So, I mean, if you were a serious person interested in influence, well, there are other places you could be. You could get a job in the city or something. Journalism was quite a powerful career. There were other things to do other than go and be, in some ways, a sort of glorified social worker in Parliament, where you really didn't necessarily have great influence over the fate of nations in the same way as you used to. Maybe that changes now. It is a challenge, and how you get people back into that, particularly when you have very tightly controlled party systems, in the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, both of them. It's very, very hard to become a candidate in either of them. They control a lot of safe seats where it's just whoever they put up will get it, and although there's local control to some extent over selection, they brought a lot of it towards the centre to try and control representation on lists and one thing and another. So it's very hard, and it's very hard for independents as a result. But I don't know, except that you just got to hope that new people are coming forward. One thing that's happened in the UK is in the recent election, we had a lot of seats won for the Conservatives they didn't previously own in what's called the Red Wall, in the northern seats, the Midland seats that used to belong to the Labour Party. So that brings in a different flavour of candidate, and they might bring some fresh ideas, but we'll see. Again, it'll take a little while for that to work through.
Tell me, if there's going to be a pushback, it seems there's got to be something to push back with. There's got to be a viable, true and good philosophy that comes to bear that can be practically outworked in the world. One of my fears is that perhaps conservatism has lost its soul a little bit of late. What I mean by that is, when I think of conservatism, I think of the likes of Edmund Burke and this idea you have tradition and you couple that with a concern for the future and for future generations. You bring the two together and that should guide your actions in the present. But it seems to me a lot of that's been lost. And when you talk to conservatives now, it seems there's a lot more libertarianism, perhaps a bit more moral libertine thinking married up with some free market capitalism. But that sort of great depth of thought and that sound philosophical basis for the movement, I worry that's a little bit lacking at the moment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I said earlier, the key to this kind of revolutionary battle is at a surprisingly high intellectual level. It's not about the mass of people, and what's happened is that it's taken root. These bad ideas have taken root in the universities and among that high intellectual class. So really, what you need is new ideas that feed in at that level, and it takes a very long time to develop these ideas. I mean, look, these ones that are now wielding power and controlling things in society have been in the makings for 30, 40 years or longer. And when the free market ideas came along in the 1980s, those again took 50 years or so to make their way into the mainstream. So it's sort of a generational task. And I agree that I don't necessarily see enough people thinking about that and working about how to develop a sort of richer intellectual framework for people to cling to. But if we don't have those sort of ideas, those refreshing of the intellectual well, then there isn't really anything to fight with. I think that is one of the problems, and perhaps one of the problems for Christianity too. I think to the extent it's had energy in recent years, some of that has been of an evangelical kind, which is nothing wrong with that. But it's not always been so perhaps theologically or intellectually focused, or at least in a form that would engage with very smart people. It's an interesting question there. As the mission to the universities or to the intellectuals, what would that look like? Good challenge for some people.
Well, and I think it's also that robustness, isn't it? That it seems to me a lot of Christianity has retreated from the public square and just ceded the ground because perhaps they haven't, either out of fear or haven't had the tools to actually have that robust and bring 2,000 years of wisdom and important principles about the human person and everything else to the debate.
Yeah, and I mean there are examples, like the work of René Girard is very, very interesting, and extremely influential in certain circles, and that's a very particularly sort of Christian view of philosophy in the world and how it works, which has surprising traction in Silicon Valley, for example, but not known still to a lot of people, and that's just one example. I think one advantage of Christianity being so underrated and very smart people being ignorant about it is that there's a lot in there waiting to be found. When you don't look at something that's very powerful and true for a long time, then you'll be surprised when you turn your gaze that way.
Yeah, and hopefully when they find that pearl of great price, they sell everything to keep a hold of it. One thing I think that the other side have done very well is they have grasped the importance of entertainment media. Obviously, we know the situation, the mainstream media is pretty dire, but entertainment media is a very effective sort of formation and propaganda tool. I think it was Marx who talked about the idea of artists being the conscience of society, and they seem to have grasped that as a tool. There's something ironic in this, really, when you think about it, though, that Marxism's whole idea of particularly the postmodernists, that, there are no overarching narratives, and then they use narrative storytelling to tell us that the overarching narrative is there is no overarching narrative. It's quite ironic. But they've done this very well. Do you think perhaps those on the other side have dropped the ball a little bit in understanding this, or is it maybe that because that intellectual rigour is lacking, we haven't had so much of the great mythologies to bring to the table?
And I think the ball has been dropped to some extent. And again, people who think only in economic terms tend to miss the importance of culture and the power of things like this. If some of the money that people ploughed into political campaigning had been spent, say, in the US on I don't know, buying a few women's magazines or setting up a movie studio or things of this kind. Andrew Breitbart always talked about this. He understood this because he came from a Hollywood background. It is a problem. And although it's perhaps true that the sort of openness and creativity that goes with working in the arts might tend to lean towards some of these sort of more left-wing opinions, I think it's also true that there's a superpower in the arts of working in traditions and understanding where you come from and as you say, the rich stories that you can draw on. So it's by no means impossible to fight back. But of course, the critical thing is to produce good work. And if it was all indoctrination and conservative art, that's as bad as anything, and no one's going to watch that. But that's not to say that you can't do quite powerful stories in these formats.
Well, I don't know if you've seen Terrence Malick's film A Hidden Life, but that's a great example of beauty, and beauty draws you into the truth of this, and it's so profound. It's a very rich film, but it's not simply a series of talking points. It is a beautiful piece of visual art that draws you into the deepness of that truth.
Yeah, no, Malick's a remarkable talent, and I think that's one of his finest films, and certainly one of his more accessible films. And I really enjoyed that recently. Also, there's a new film called Mr. Jones, which if you haven't seen is well worth it. Which is again, it's very well made, very entertaining might be the wrong word, but it's a gripping narrative, and it's the story of how the New York Times covered up for Stalin's famine in the Ukraine, and it's a chilling story and actually very timely in many ways, because it's impossible not to think about what's going on in China now when you watch it.
One film I often tell young people, particularly at university, to watch is Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. Great German film, but also focuses on the Scholl family and what they did in this context of a culture of death, really. It was so contrary. But they lived out heroically, and they built their own subculture within that of goodness, truth and beauty, and they paid the ultimate price, but just profound courage in that. And it gives hope, I think, to people to realise, hey, if they did that, I can do that in my modern university context too. Yeah,
sure. That sounds great. I don't know that one.
Well worth the watch. Look, in your book, you talk about the use of new media as a tool. It seems to me that big tech is starting to get wise, or they have done in the last 12 months, to the way in which their platforms have been used by people they might not agree with. Does that mean that the vision needs to be bigger than just simply setting yourself up on social media? That needs to go bigger than that? It needs to be a vision for creating new platforms? What do you think that's got to actually look like?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important for people to remember is that you can't put yourself in a silo. If you lock yourself away by yourself, then you might have all sorts of fun, like-minded conversations, but you will never change anyone's mind. You will certainly never influence the culture. The people who succeeded in that succeeded because they talked to people outside the family, if you like. The Fabian Society in the UK, which is George Bernard Shaw, people like that, laying the foundations for vast sort of socialist light, but still socialist incursions into how Britain ran its society, which came into force at the end of the Second World War. And that was huge social change. But they brought that about by talking to people in other networks and people who wouldn't necessarily have agreed with them. And one of the dangers online is that if people get stuck in their own little worlds, so building platforms, yes, but only ones that are plugged in and can bring in people who aren't just already on board. If you end up in the echo chambers, it's fine. There's some merit to at least being able to talk about these things, but you have to remember what you might be giving up.
One of the things you talk about in your strategy is this idea of not falling prey to the false dichotomy, really, of politics versus culture. You both and I think that's great, because there's a lot of false dichotomy often flies around. But what does that actually look like in practice? Because it seems that to get that right, you've really got to get it right. So what do you think some of the practical ways that would actually, what would that look like? Where you bring the two together, you don't say, well, it's only about culture and not about politics, or it's only about politics and not about culture.
Well, I mean, I do end the book by being quite serious about the potential of politics. I see them in some ways as working at different timescales. So at the cultural level, change is very powerful, but it's very, very slow. Like I say, it's really a generational matter. And if people, are serious about that, they need to be serious about getting into networks where they can talk to people outside their own faith, as it were, and build serious ideas at a serious level at the universities, whatever. But that's going to take a very long time. Politics, though, politics has an immense property in that, because of the secret ballots, the fact that we aren't allowed to say in public what we really think it doesn't come into play in elections. So people can be elected even if their ideas can't be talked about in public. It's one of the funny things that happened in the UK. Boris Johnson's won an absolutely stonking majority, but culturally it would seem like his ideas are things that no one actually agrees with. But it's just some presentation that you get. So you can win politically in the short term. And then the challenge is how you use politics to change culture in the short term and to try and fight back. And that this is in some ways a sort of internal challenge for the people who are elected and their advisors. But that's what I think Boris Johnson is trying to think about now, and of course somewhat derailed by sort of the apocalypse that descended on us. But how can he make political decisions that start to push back against the BBC's control of narrative and things like that? And I think we might start to see some of that coming through. I think they're probably going to no longer make it a criminal offence not to pay the licence fee. That seems quite possible that might come in, and that starts to change things a lot, and maybe move the BBC away from the kind of monopoly it holds, and perhaps change some laws there. There's already a legal challenge, legal lawfare. Using the law to demand your rights is very important. Some of that's going on around free speech issues in the UK. And one example is, so I talk about the sex education rules that were brought in for some reason under a Conservative government, but it was Theresa May who was not the most conservative of Conservative leaders. And is really sort of enforce the state's standards of sex and relationship education on everyone, on all the kids. And someone's now challenging that and asking for a judicial review because there's no way of opting out of it, at least in primary school. So things like that. I think you look for the short-term wins on the political front, and then culturally, you're thinking about the longer game. But as I say, the big ideas for the universities, but also, as we were just discussing, arts and entertainment and magazines and that sort of space as well. And there's room there, especially with the internet now, to create new things. I think particularly in the arts and entertainment, the ability to reach new audiences through the internet. Because even though big tech is wary and is trying to close down some things, and some of that's to do with the election in the US, which is impending, but they also are in business to make money. And there are a lot of people who don't agree with these sort of very particular high intellectual left-wing views, and those people use these media, and they can't shut them all off because their companies won't work.
How important is Christianity to this project? Because it seems to me that, first of all, one of the things you talked about is the idea of people being bullied out of positions and that constant persecution they experience if they have the wrong think. It seems that in a situation like that if you had some grounding in the transcendent, that would help you to hang in that little bit longer, maybe. Secondly, the way in which now you realise how fundamental the concept of human anthropology that's authentic, human rights, which are being co-opted in a very duplicitous and wrong way for various movements at the moment. You realise that you actually need something of substance to bring to the table. And the more you look at the West, I think of Larry Seidentop's book about the origins of liberalism in the West. And I know Douglas Murray's talked about this as well. There's these atheist minds who are saying Christianity and the West are, hand in glove. You can't do one without the other. How important is Christianity to this project, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Christian myself, and I obviously think it's enormously important. That's a challenge in the UK, which is quite an irreligious country, despite having the established church and so forth. And one of my more heretical views is that I suspect disestablishment would probably be very good for the church, because it would maybe shock people and make them realize that, I need to actually stand up and be part of this if I want it to continue. But that aside, I do think it's important, because, as you say, it brings in all these ideas. It's a kind of intellectual foundation. Even people like, as you say, Douglas, who used to go to church and doesn't anymore, but is nonetheless perhaps even more serious than he always was about the importance of Christianity. But there's the problem. Very smart people who can see why it might matter are saying that in a sort of abstract sense, but not in a believing way. And I think how you get over that hump, or say how you come up with a kind of approach to Christianity that allows smart people who have read an awful lot of books to find their way into it again, because I think that's a real problem, and if you can get them over that hump, then that would be an enormous change. But Rod Dreher, you mentioned earlier, and he's very, very interesting on Christianity. I think he sees in the US how Christians are really at the sharp end of this in many ways, particularly there. The laws around what they can do are going to run into sort of cultural forces that want to stop them from following their own beliefs quite early on. And he initially had this idea called the Benedict option, where you'd move away from the center, you'd go and find some small rural community, and a bit like St. Benedict and the monks, you'd create your own little intentional community where you'd live as you wanted to do, and ignore the rest of the world. And fair enough, there's some merit in that, although it's quite hard to ignore the world forever. But his new book, which is coming out in September, which is called Live Not by Lies, sounds very, very interesting indeed. And he's basically gone and talked to a lot of the people who lived under communism in Eastern Europe, and how people of faith held the line there and what they did, because he thinks that it's no longer enough just to run away from it, that a lot of Christians who are serious are going to end up having to have the faith to see it through. And I think in general, the Cold War, it was very instructive. If you look back in history, a lot of the people who were against the communists in the Cold War and really wanted to see that evil empire shut down, didn't necessarily think that they were going to win, but they had faith. It wasn't always a Christian faith, but certainly for some of them it was. But it was a real commitment that this was the right thing to do, and they needed to stick with it. If all you are interested in is, what works now, or, you don't necessarily have what it takes for these sort of long generational fights. And certainly Christian faith is one enormous sense of source of strength in that sort of situation.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I'm actually a huge fan of the Benedict option. I think that what's at the heart of it about building authentic community, which has so often been lost in the West, is so important. But you're right. The situation is such that when you're dealing with people who believe that they have a mission to build the brave new world, they're not going to just let you sit on the peripheries. They're going to come for you and demand that you convert. That's how these things sort of work, right? So you have to be prepared for that reality.
The Malick film, which is exactly about that. You can't escape Nazism even if you're living in a tiny valley of the Alps.
Exactly. One last question to finish with, very practical. The book is great, very accessible. I'm living over here in New Zealand, and even though there's a very British context to it, there's so much that is relevant to us, and I think globally. What, on a practical level, though, can we do to begin the conversation, perhaps with those who are still, to borrow a phrase, in the matrix, if you like? How do you begin to reach out? You've talked about earlier the importance of going beyond your own family, quote unquote. How do you actually do that with people in the current climate? How do we try and foster a climate of dialogue?
I think the honest answer to that is it is extremely difficult. And one of the things that I try and say in the book is I think it's helpful to understand that, in a sense, this is a war that has been lost. You're in the position of someone who has been conquered. And if you don't understand that, it's quite dangerous, because you might do foolish things like speak up in ways that are going to get you fired, or are going to have people ostracize you and really harm your life in very bad ways. And there's no point in sort of willfully putting yourself in that situation. Understand, the potential risks and the dangers, and find ways to talk to people in reasonable terms within the limits of that. But I think it's that search for common ground is what we're all after. And things like most people really don't agree with the things that are behind things, but they don't necessarily know. Everyone is in the streets for Black Lives Matter because no one likes racism. Basically that's what's going on. But they also don't know what Black Lives Matters, the movement, is actually about hating the family, hating the capitalist system, wanting to tear everything down, run by committed Marxists and community organizers. And maybe if you find the right situation with the right people, trying to say, you really agree with this, you don't agree with this, do you, or something. There are ways in, but I would advise people to tread cautiously.
One thing I heard recently, I read an article actually where the author, I thought it was a great little strategy, said, have the conversation with people where you ask them, what would be your red line limit? If this happened, would that be too far? So at least cognitively, they've started to think what the line is, rather than crossing it and then realizing 2 years later, oh, gee, I wish I hadn't participated in crossing that line. They've already thought about it before they got there. There was something in that, I thought.
Very good. Yes. And I think sometimes, you can look back as well as, I think people would have laughed 20 years ago at where we ended up. They wouldn't have thought it was possible. It creeps up in you, as part of the point of my book, it creeps up in you very, very slowly. So if you sort of pause for a moment and look back and think, gosh, I would never have thought that I would have got this far.
Mark, I can't recommend your book highly enough. Where do people get themselves a copy to read the book?
So we're in the process of getting an ebook up on Amazon, but that's taking a little bit of time. But if people go to the New Culture Forum's website, it's published by the New Culture Forum in the UK. It's very easy to find on Google. And there's a free PDF on there that people can just download to read right away. But if you email them, they'll also send out a copy, although perhaps to New Zealand that might be a bit ambitious.
Might arrive by 2025 if we're lucky. And also the upcoming Smith magazine. Have you got a website or some socials or anything where do people follow you if they want to follow your thought?
I think the best thing for them to follow would be the New Culture Forum on YouTube itself. So the New Culture Forum has had a real focus on creating these new institutions, creating a sort of online series of interviews. There's several interviews with me. There's me reading the first chapter of the book, but there's lots of terrific interviews with all the sort of top conservative minds. And there's a couple of different shows. There's one that's sort of one-to-one interview called Say What You're Saying Is. There's another called Counterculture, which is sort of sofa discussion show. There's Newspeak, which is just sort of people giving very short sort of op-eds to camera. This is all on the New Culture Forum YouTube channel. So you'll find me there. You find lots of other people too, and it's well worth a visit.
Folks, we'll post a link in the video description for this particular episode as well. Mark, thank you so much. The book was excellent, and thank you for taking the time, more importantly, to actually speak to us today. I found it a really engaging and important conversation.
My pleasure, Brendan. Thank you so much for taking the time too.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side, our fears are done. Oh, the good times just begun. Oh, we know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.